The voice on the television speaks with fatherly warmth about rebirth and purpose, while hands in rubber gloves inject yellow liquid directly into your tear ducts. When the procedure ends, you wake on a bench outside a facility you don't remember entering, holding identification papers for a person you're not sure you've ever been. The headache throbs where the goggles fuse to your skull. You reach up to remove them and discover they don't come off anymore. They're part of you now. This is how the Outlast Trials begins. Not with a monster, but with a choice you didn't know you were making. The flyer promised opportunity. The application process felt legitimate. The paperwork used words like volunteer and training and service to your country. By the time you understood what you'd actually agreed to, you were already strapped to a table in the Signala facility, becoming a reagent in Project Lathe. And the door you'd walked through had been welded shut behind you. Over the next hours, we're going to explore the complete psychology of how Murkoff Corporation turns ordinary people into weapons through systematic fascist conditioning. We'll examine each trial as a lesson in authoritarian control, break down the 14 properties of fascism that Umberto Eco identified, and show how every single one appears in the reagent programs, and trace the path from kidnapped civilian to programmable sleeper agent. By the end, you'll understand how fascist psychology works at the individual level, why the Outlast Trials is one of gaming's most disturbing commentaries on authoritarian control, and how easy it is to break a human being when you know exactly which psychological buttons to push. If you find something in this deep dive that resonated with you, go ahead and drop a comment letting me know what part hit hardest, whether it was a specific trial, a psychological concept that connected, or just a moment that made you pause. And while you're down there, throw out a topic suggestion for a future video. I'm always looking for the next horror game rabbit hole to fall into, and some of the best video ideas have come straight from you guys. Building this community means interacting with each other in the comments. That's my favorite part of all this. So get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's start. The idea you need to hold through this entire analysis is simple. Murkoff didn't invent fascism. They perfected it at the individual level, one shattered mind at a time. Chapter 1: The Cold War Machine. 1959 sits in the middle of the Cold War like a pressure point on a nerve. The Soviet Union has nuclear weapons. American prisoners of war return from Korea speaking in rehearsed confessions, praising the governments that captured them. Their minds, seemingly rewritten by techniques the West doesn't understand. The fear isn't just of bombs anymore. The fear is that consciousness itself has become a battlefield, that the next war will be fought inside people's heads, and America is losing. The Central Intelligence Agency launches MK Ultra in 1953, a program designed to answer one question: can you reprogram a human being? Can you erase someone's beliefs, implant new loyalties, create sleeper agents who live normal lives until a trigger phrase transforms them into weapons? Between 1953 and 1973, the CIA conducts experiments that sound like science fiction. Unwitting citizens dosed with LSD in public spaces. Sensory deprivation chambers designed to break down ego boundaries. Electroshock therapy administered until patients lose their memories. Surgical intervention on living brains. One location becomes particularly notorious. The Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal houses something called the Sleep Room, where Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron performs experiments that destroy his patients from the inside out. People arrive seeking treatment for depression or anxiety. They receive drug-induced comas lasting weeks, while speakers hidden beneath their pillows play recorded messages on endless loops. Cameron believes he can erase damaged minds and rebuild them from scratch, turn human consciousness into something that can be wiped clean and reprogrammed like a machine. Linda McDonald enters McGill University seeking help for postpartum depression after her 5th child. She spends 86 days in a drug-induced coma in the sleep room. Records show 109 rounds of electroshock therapy. When she emerges, Linda has lost her identity, her memories, and her motor skills. She requires toilet training. Her children are strangers. Her husband is a man she doesn't recognize. Dr. Cameron's treatment didn't cure her depression. It erased the person who was depressed and left someone else in her body. Robert Logie is 18 years old with leg pain when he arrives at McGill. He receives LSD injections every other day for weeks, sometimes mixed with sodium amytal, truth serum. A speaker under his pillow plays one phrase for 23 days straight. You killed your mother. His mother is alive. The phrase is a lie designed to create artificial guilt. Implant false memories. See if consciousness can be rewritten through repetition and drugs and sensory manipulation. Robert leaves McGill with amnesia, insomnia, and psychological damage that will follow him for the rest of his life. The leg pain persists. The treatment created new problems without solving the original one. These aren't conspiracy theories. The documents are declassified. The victims are real people with names and families and lives that were destroyed by experiments conducted under the banner of national security. The question that haunts the Outlast series is simple. What happened to all that research when MK Ultra officially ended? Where did the accumulated knowledge about breaking and rebuilding human minds go when the government programs shut down? In the Outlast Trials, the answer is Murkoff Corporation, a private company with government contracts, no public oversight, and facilities in remote locations where screams don't carry to anyone who might care. In the game's fiction, MK Ultra didn't end. It's privatized. The techniques got refined. The test subjects got easier to acquire because corporations can operate in places and ways that even intelligence agencies can't. And by 1959, Murkoff has built the Sinyala facility in the Arizona desert, where Dr. Hendrik Joliet Easterman runs Project Lathe, the largest psychological conditioning program in American history. The facility targets society's most vulnerable populations. Flyers appear in unemployment offices, homeless shelters, immigrant communities. They promise good pay, room and board, opportunity to serve your country while building a better future. The language is calibrated to appeal to people who are struggling, who need something to believe in, who are desperate enough to ignore the vague details and unclear timeline. Applicants are screened for specific vulnerabilities, few close relationships, minimal family ties, history suggesting emotional damage or social isolation, people who won't be missed if they disappear for months or years. Some recruits are less voluntary. Murkoff has relationships with law enforcement and prison systems. Judges offer criminals a choice: serve your full sentence or volunteer for a program that leads to early release. Psychiatric hospitals transfer treatment-resistant patients to a specialized facility. Homeless individuals, drifters, anyone living on society's margins becomes fair game. The recruiters don't discriminate based on demographics. They discriminate based on vulnerability. If you're someone who fell through society's cracks, someone the system already failed, someone whose absence won't trigger investigations, you're a perfect candidate for Project Lathe. The recruits arrive at Sinyala in unmarked vehicles, always at night. They're told they'll be participating in psychological resilience training, exercises designed to enhance mental toughness. Some believe they're being trained as intelligence operatives. Others think they're part of experimental therapy for treating trauma. The specifics vary, but the core lie remains the same. You volunteered. You're helping your country. You'll leave better than you arrived. The processing begins immediately. Personal belongings confiscated. Medical examinations conducted by doctors who don't make eye contact. And then the moment that marks every reagent permanently, the implantation of night vision goggles directly onto the skull. The procedure is presented as necessary equipment for training exercises. The reality is far darker. The goggles serve as physical marking, permanent modification that makes it impossible to forget what's been done to your body. They create dependency because navigating the facility's deliberately darkened corridors becomes nearly impossible without the goggles' enhanced vision, and they serve as psychological break, a moment of body horror that begins the process of dissociating subjects from their sense of self. After processing, each person receives their new designation, reagent. The term is deliberately clinical, stripping away names and identities in favor of a label that suggests you're a chemical component in someone else's experiment. Each reagent gets a number. Their past lives are declared irrelevant. Easterman's recorded messages insist that reagents should think of themselves as blank slates being prepared for important work. The message underneath the careful phrasing is clear. You don't exist as an individual anymore. You're raw material waiting to be shaped into something useful. This initial processing achieves something crucial. It separates reagents from their sense of continuity, makes them question whether the person they were before arriving still exists. The night vision goggles, drilled into their skulls, serve as constant physical reminder that they've been fundamentally altered. Every time a reagent sees their reflection, they see someone marked, someone changed, someone who can't simply walk away and return to normal life, because normal ended the moment metal bit bone. The Signala facility itself reinforces this disorientation. Corridors branch unpredictably. Rooms that should be identical have subtle differences that register subconsciously. Lighting levels vary without pattern. Temperature stays slightly uncomfortable, never quite warm enough to relax. Sound is weaponized throughout. Speakers hidden in walls play ambiguous noises, footsteps that might be other reagents or X-pops or nothing but recordings, distant screams that could be genuine distress or atmospheric effects. Easterman's voice appears at unpredictable intervals, sometimes offering false comfort, sometimes delivering commands, sometimes just speaking reassurances that create Pavlovian associations between his voice and temporary safety. Between orientation sessions, reagents are introduced to what Murkoff calls the sleep room. The name is borrowed directly from Dr. Cameron's facility in Montreal. Murkoff knows their history. They're not hiding from it. They're refining it. The sleep room at Signala can house dozens of reagents simultaneously. The space is designed to be womb-like and prison-like at once. Soft lighting, comfortable beds, but no windows, no clocks, no way to measure time or orient yourself to the outside world. Speakers throughout the sleep room play Easterman's voice on constant loops. The broadcasts are masterfully manipulative. He presents himself as a father figure, concerned and paternal, someone who believes in the reagent's potential. He praises their courage for volunteering. He assures them that discomfort is temporary, a necessary step toward becoming something better. The careful tone masks the content's actual purpose, breaking down psychological resistance through repetition, creating dependency on his approval, establishing his voice as the primary authority on reality itself. Between broadcasts, reagents receive pharmaceutical cocktails designed by Murkoff's chemical division. The drugs enhance suggestibility, making subjects more receptive to programming. They disrupt memory formation, creating temporal disorientation where reagents can't clearly remember how long they've been in the facility. Days blur into weeks. Weeks might be months. The pharmaceutical fog makes it impossible to maintain narrative continuity. They induce mild hallucinatory states, blurring the line between what's real and what's chemical effect, and they create physical dependency. Reagents who try to resist experience withdrawal symptoms that can only be alleviated by compliance. The sleep room is presented as a place of rest between trials. The reality is that the sleep room is where the deepest programming occurs. Easterman understands something fundamental about human psychology. Physical torture leaves marks and can be resisted through defiance. Psychological manipulation works better when it happens during moments of vulnerability, when subjects are exhausted, drugged, desperate for anything resembling comfort. The sleep room offers that false comfort, conditioning reagents to associate compliance with relief and resistance with isolation and suffering. This is the foundation. Before any trial begins, before any lesson is explicitly taught, the infrastructure of control is already in place. Reagents have been physically marked, stripped of identity, severed from their past, disoriented in time and space, made chemically dependent, and conditioned to hear Easterman's voice as the source of meaning in an otherwise incomprehensible environment. Everything that follows builds on this foundation. The trials don't create broken people from scratch. They work with people who've already been systematically destabilized, whose defenses are already compromised, who are already looking for something to believe in because everything familiar has been taken away. That foundation is fascism in microcosm, the targeting of vulnerable populations, the severing of connections to previous life and identity, the creation of dependency through physical and chemical means, the establishment of a single authoritative voice that interprets reality, the architectural design that disorients and controls. Every element serves the same purpose, making resistance psychologically expensive and compliance psychologically rewarding. By the time reagents enter their first trial, they've already been conditioned to follow instructions, trust authority, and suppress their own judgment. They just don't realize it yet. The trials themselves are where theory becomes practice, where the psychological foundation transforms into behavioral conditioning, where Murkoff teaches reagents the specific lessons they'll need to function as sleeper agents in the field. Each trial is designed around a particular fascist principle, drilling it into reagents through experiential learning that bypasses conscious resistance. You can tell someone 1,000 times that disagreement is treason, but if you create an environment where disagreeing gets you killed, the lesson bypasses intellectual understanding and embeds directly into survival instinct. Before we enter the trials, you need to understand the framework Murkoff is using, the 14 properties of fascism identified by Umberto Eco in 1995. These aren't just historical observations about mid-20th century totalitarian regimes. They're operational principles that appear in any system designed to control populations through psychological manipulation and authoritarian structure. Murkoff uses every single one, and understanding them transforms the trials from random horror scenarios into precisely calibrated lessons in fascist psychology. But here's what makes the Outlast Trials genuinely disturbing. These properties don't just appear in the game's fiction. They appear in real psychological conditioning programs, real authoritarian movements, real systems of control that exist in the world outside the game. Recognizing them in Signala Facility teaches you to recognize them everywhere else. The game isn't just horror, it's education disguised as entertainment, showing you exactly how fascism operates at the individual psychological level. That makes the next section uncomfortable, because once you see the framework, you can't unsee it. You start recognizing the patterns in marketing, in political rhetoric, in workplace dynamics, in social media algorithms. Fascism isn't just jackboots and flags. It's psychological techniques that can be deployed in any context where someone wants to control how other people think and behave. Murkoff Corporation is fiction. The principles they use are not. We're about to catalog those 14 properties and show how each one appears in the reagent trials. Keep track of which ones feel familiar from contexts outside the game. That moment of recognition is part of what makes the Outlast Trials More than just another horror game. It's showing you something real, something that exists and operates and shapes behavior in ways most people never consciously recognize. The trials are waiting, the prime assets are ready, and Easterman's voice is about to teach you lessons that you'll carry with you long after the game ends. Chapter 2. Umberto Eco's 14 Points and the Architecture of Fascism. In 1995, Italian writer and philosopher Umberto Eco published a series of essays. He'd lived through Mussolini's regime as a child, watched how fascism took root in Italian society, observed the psychological and cultural mechanisms that made ordinary people accept and participate in authoritarian control. His essay identifies 14 properties that characterize fascist movements. He emphasizes that not all 14 need to be present simultaneously. Even one or two can create conditions where fascism coagulates, where authoritarian structures begin forming around initial principles like mold on bread. Murkoff Corporation isn't running a government. They're running a conditioning program inside a private facility. But they use every single one of Eco's 14 properties because those properties aren't just about political systems. They're about psychological control at its most fundamental level. Understanding these 14 points transforms how you see the trials. Each property becomes a lens that reveals what Murkoff is actually teaching, why the trials are designed the way they are, and how they systematically program reagents into fascist psychology. The cult of tradition. This property involves rejecting the idea that human knowledge and values evolve over time. Instead, fascism freezes a particular moment and declares it the eternal truth. Everything that came before is heritage to be preserved. Everything that comes after is corruption to be resisted. The cult of tradition teaches that the answers already exist in the past, that looking forward is dangerous, that questioning inherited wisdom is betrayal. In the Signala facility, tradition gets weaponized through Murkoff's corporate language and American imagery. The trials take place in settings that represent traditional American institutions: police stations, courthouses, orphanages, factories. These aren't random locations. They're deliberate invocations of a specific vision of American society, one where authority is absolute, where institutions are benevolent, where questioning the system marks you as deviant. The trials teach reagents to accept these traditional structures without examination, to see police authority as inherently legitimate, to view courtroom verdicts as inherently just, to treat factory production as inherently valuable. Easterman's broadcasts reinforce this constantly. He speaks about American values, about service to your country, about returning to a better way of life. The subtext is clear. There was a golden age, a time when people knew their place and did their duty, and reagents are being trained to embody that idealized past. The fact that this golden age never actually existed doesn't matter. The cult of tradition isn't about historical accuracy. It's about creating a mythologized past that justifies present control. The rejection of modernism. This property functions as the other side of tradition's coin. If tradition is perfect, then modernity must be corrupt. Fascism teaches suspicion of intellectual advancement, scientific progress, cultural evolution. It associates Enlightenment values like reason and individual rights with weakness and decay. Modernity becomes something to fear rather than embrace. The Outlast Trials presents this through its Cold War setting. The game takes place in 1959, but the facility's design deliberately evokes earlier periods. The orphanage looks like something from the 19th century. The police station uses aesthetic elements from the 1930s and 40s. Even the technology, despite being cutting-edge pharmaceutical and psychological research, is presented through retro-futuristic design that makes it feel simultaneously advanced and antiquated. This rejection of modernism shows most clearly in how trials treat individual autonomy and critical thinking. Modern psychology emphasizes personal agency, informed consent, therapeutic relationships built on trust. Murkoff's program rejects all of that. Reagents don't get choices, they get orders. They don't develop personal understanding, they receive programming. The entire system operates on the premise that modern concepts like individual rights and personal autonomy are obstacles to be overcome rather than values to be respected. Action for action's sake. Eco describes this as the cult of action, the belief that doing something, anything, is inherently better than thinking carefully about what should be done. Fascism distrusts intellectual reflection because thinking creates opportunities to notice contradictions, recognize injustice, question authority. Better to act first and never think at all. Thinking is reframed as weakness, as feminine, as something that prevents necessary action. Every trial in Signala embodies this principle. Reagents face constant time pressure. Objectives must be completed quickly. Hesitation brings danger. The prime assets patrol continuously, punishing any reagent who stops to think or question. The message embedded in this structure is unmistakable. Act immediately. Follow orders without reflection. Complete. Objectives without considering their morality. Reagents who pause to think about what they're doing, who wonder whether destroying evidence or identifying snitches or sabotaging machinery serves any legitimate purpose, quickly discover that thought gets you killed. The pharmaceutical conditioning reinforces this. The drugs administered in the sleep room don't just increase suggestibility, they reduce the cognitive processing time between receiving instruction and acting on it. Reagents find themselves completing objectives before consciously deciding to do so, their bodies moving on trained instinct while their minds struggle to catch up. This creates the psychological pattern fascism requires: action without thought, obedience without reflection, movement without meaning. Disagreement is treason. Fascism cannot tolerate criticism because criticism threatens the entire structure. If people are allowed to disagree, they might notice contradictions in the ideology. They might recognize that the authorities are fallible. They might develop alternative visions of how things should be. Fascism prevents this by collapsing the distinction between disagreement and betrayal. To question is to oppose. To oppose is to threaten. To threaten is to commit treason, deserving punishment. The trial called Kill the Snitch teaches this lesson explicitly. Reagents must identify someone designated as a snitch and deliver them for execution. The snitch hasn't actually betrayed anyone. They're arbitrarily labeled, but the trial forces reagents to participate in punishing someone for the crime of being identified as disloyal. The lesson isn't subtle. Disagreement and disloyalty are the same thing, and both deserve death. Reagents who hesitate, who question whether the designated snitch deserves punishment, quickly find themselves targeted by ex-pops and prime assets. The system tolerates no questioning. This extends to the post-trial evaluation reports. Murkoff grades reagents partially on their ability to suppress individual thought. High scores require what the reports call groupthink, where reagents function as a unified collective rather than individuals with separate perspectives. Lower scores identify perverse insistence on individuation, treating individual identity as a flaw to be corrected. The message is explicit: thinking for yourself is failure. Absorbing group consensus without question is success. Fear of difference. Fascism requires homogeneity because diversity introduces perspectives that might question the system. Different people bring different values, different ways of thinking, different visions of what society should be. Fascism teaches populations to fear these differences, to see outsiders as threats, to treat diversity as contamination rather than strength. The Outlast Trials makes this literal through the X-Pop population. X-Pops are failed reagents from earlier iterations of Project Lathe, people whose minds broke in ways that made them violent and unstable. They're visibly different, physically and behaviorally marked as other. The trials use X-Pops as hostile obstacles, teaching reagents to see difference as danger, to respond to anyone who doesn't fit the program norm with immediate violence. The fear of difference also appears in how trials structure cooperation. Reagents work in teams, but successful teams are those that function with perfect uniformity. Everyone moves at the same pace. Everyone prioritizes the same objectives. Anyone who deviates from group behavior, who wants to explore alternative strategies, or question the mission parameters, becomes a liability. The trials don't just discourage individuality, they make individuality actively dangerous to the group's survival. Appeal to social frustration. Fascism thrives when populations are angry, frustrated, looking for someone to blame for their suffering. This property involves directing that frustration downward at more vulnerable groups, rather than upward at systems of power. If you can convince the middle class that poor people are stealing their resources through welfare, they won't notice corporations extracting far more wealth through tax evasion. If you can make citizens fear immigrants more than exploitative employers, you maintain control while avoiding accountability. Murkoff deploys this through the reagent X-Pop relationship. Reagents are suffering, trapped in a nightmare they didn't consent to, experiencing constant danger and psychological torment. The trials direct that suffering's energy toward X-Pops rather than toward Murkoff itself. Reagents learn to hate and fear the violent failed subjects rather than the corporation that created those failures. X-Pops become scapegoats, absorbing blame that should fall on the system that produced them. The grading reports reinforce this by praising reagents who demonstrate contempt for weaker team members. Reports note when there's clearly disposable weak link among the group, suggesting that identifying and sacrificing vulnerable members is desirable behavior. This teaches reagents to direct their frustration at whoever seems weakest, rather than recognizing that everyone in the facility is a victim of the same system. Obsession with a plot. Eco observes that fascism needs enemies to function. Without external threats, the entire authoritarian structure loses justification. This creates obsession with plots, with conspiracies, with hidden enemies who must be constantly fought. The enemy is everywhere and nowhere. They're infiltrating institutions, corrupting youth, undermining traditional values. The fascist state must remain constantly vigilant, must maintain extreme security measures, must justify surveillance and control through the ever-present threat. The Outlast Trials embeds this through the trial objectives themselves. Reagents are constantly hunting infiltrators, destroying evidence of plots, preventing sabotage. The specifics vary, but the underlying message remains consistent. Enemies are everywhere. Trust no one. Constant vigilance is the only safety. The police station trial involves identifying snitches. The courthouse trial involves destroying evidence that could implicate authority. The factory trial involves preventing worker sabotage. Every scenario teaches that there are hidden enemies requiring exposure and punishment. Easterman's broadcasts reinforce this obsession. He speaks about threats to American security, about communist infiltration, about the need for people capable of recognizing and neutralizing enemies who hide in plain sight. He's training reagents to see threats everywhere, to interpret ambiguous situations as evidence of conspiracy, to respond to uncertainty with suspicion rather than curiosity. This psychological pattern is exactly what fascist regimes require, populations that police themselves because they believe danger lurks around every corner. The enemy is both strong and weak. This property captures a fundamental contradiction in fascist thinking. The enemy must be strong enough to justify extreme measures, powerful enough that fighting them requires every citizen's participation. Simultaneously, the enemy must be weak enough that victory is assured, pathetic enough that the fascist population can feel superior. This contradiction shouldn't work logically, but emotionally it functions perfectly, creating both fear that motivates action and contempt that assures triumph. Murkoff deploys this through how they present X-Pops and prime assets. X-Pops are dangerous, capable of killing reagents, numerous enough that teams must stay constantly alert. The trials present them as serious threats requiring skill and coordination to overcome. Simultaneously, X-Pops are pathetic failures, broken minds shambling through corridors, proof of what happens when you can't meet Murkoff's standards. They're terrifying and contemptible at once. This contradiction serves its purpose. Reagents learn to fear failure while believing success is inevitable if they just follow protocol. The threat is real enough to justify obedience, weak enough that obedience feels like it guarantees safety. This emotional pattern is exactly what fascism cultivates. Populations that accept authoritarian control because they're simultaneously afraid and confident, convinced that danger requires submission, but that submission ensures victory. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy. Eco notes that fascism cannot tolerate peace because peace removes justification for militarism, surveillance, and control. There must always be struggle, always be fighting, always be an enemy that requires violent opposition. To suggest peaceful resolution is to help the enemy, to demonstrate weakness, to betray the collective. Pacifism becomes indistinguishable from treason. The trials teach this through their violence requirements. Most objectives cannot be completed without participating in harm. You must electrocute the snitch. You must destroy evidence in ways that clearly implicate others in crimes. You must sabotage machinery that workers depend on. Reagents who attempt to complete objectives without participating in violence discover that the system won't allow it. The pacifist path is deliberately closed. You participate in harm or you fail the trial. Post-trial reports grade this explicitly. Reagents who demonstrate dissociative sadism receive higher marks than those who show reluctance to harm others. The reports praise real effort when reagents enthusiastically participate in violence and note concerning individual shame when they hesitate. The message is unmistakable. Violence is the answer. Hesitation is weakness. Mercy is failure. Contempt for the weak. Fascism is fundamentally elitist. The collective is superior. Members of the collective are better than outsiders. And within the collective, hierarchy is natural and just. Those at the top deserve their position. Those at the bottom deserve their suffering. Weakness of any kind, physical, mental, moral, marks you as inferior. Contempt for weakness creates permission to exploit and harm vulnerable populations because they're framed as deserving their fate. The reagent trials systematically cultivate this contempt. High-performing teams are praised. Struggling reagents are noted as problems. The grading reports explicitly state that trials would be easier with clearly disposable weak link, teaching reagents that some people are inherently expendable, that weakness justifies abandonment. The X-Pop population reinforces this. They're visible reminders that weakness leads to horrible fates, that failure makes you less than human, that the weak deserve what happens to them. This contempt extends to how trials treat casualties. Reagent deaths are acceptable losses. The system doesn't mourn them. It processes their bodies into meat for X-Pops, uses their remains as set dressing in future trials, and replaces them with new subjects. The message is clear. You have value only as long as you're useful. Weakness removes that value. Once you fail, you become disposable. Everybody is educated to become a hero. This property reveals one of fascism's darkest manipulations. Heroism sounds positive. Who doesn't want to be a hero? But in fascist context, heroism means martyrdom. It means enthusiastic willingness to die for the collective's goals. Everyone is taught that their life's purpose is noble sacrifice, that dying for the cause is the highest achievement, that self-preservation is selfish while self-destruction is virtuous. Easterman's broadcasts constantly invoke this hero complex. He tells reagents they're serving their country, doing important work, becoming something greater than they were. The subtext is that this greater purpose justifies any cost, including their lives. The trials reinforce this by creating situations where sacrificing individual safety benefits, team objectives. Reagents learn that drawing prime asset attention to let teammates complete objectives is praiseworthy, that taking risks, which might be fatal, is expected, that survival isn't the goal. Mission completion is the goal, regardless of casualties. The cult of heroism is the cult of death. Fascism needs populations willing to die on command. It achieves this by framing death as glory, by teaching that your highest purpose is sacrificing yourself, by making people believe that their worth is measured by their willingness to be destroyed for someone else's objectives. The reagents are being programmed for eventual suicide missions. They just don't know it yet. Machismo and weaponry. Eco identifies fascism's deep investment in aggressive masculinity, the idea that strength, dominance, and violence are inherently male and inherently positive. This property intertwines with contempt for women, for homosexuality, for anything coded as feminine or weak. It also involves fetishization of weapons, treating instruments of violence as extensions of masculine power. The Outlast Trials engages with this through its prime assets. Leland Coyle, the former police officer turned sadistic enforcer, embodies fascist masculinity. He's violent, aggressive, uses his authority to inflict suffering on anyone he perceives as weak or transgressive. His weapon is a cattle prod modified for maximum pain, and he wields it with sexual pleasure. The violence carrying unmistakable overtones of domination and violation. The trials featuring Coyle teach reagents that this aggressive, violent masculinity is the model to emulate. This extends to how the trials treat gender presentation and sexuality. The grading reports explicitly call for increasing bigotry in subliminal messaging. This isn't accidental. Fascism requires populations that police gender and sexual norms because deviation from those norms suggests that other deviations might be acceptable. If people can question traditional gender roles, they might question traditional authority structures. Better to program absolute adherence to narrow definitions of acceptable identity. Selective populism. Eco describes how fascism claims to represent the people's will while actually representing only the leader's interpretation of that will. Selective populism involves claiming democratic legitimacy, we speak for the people, while denying actual democratic processes. The people are invoked constantly, but never actually consulted. Their will is whatever the leader says it is. In the Signala facility, selective populism appears through Easterman's role. He presents himself as acting on behalf of reagents, training them for their own benefit, helping them become better versions of themselves. His broadcasts invoke American values, national security, collective good, but reagents never get to decide what those values mean or whether they agree with the program's goals. Easterman interprets everything. His voice is the voice of reason, of authority, of the collective will. Disagreeing with Easterman means disagreeing with America itself, with your own best interests, with objective reality. This selective populism is why the trials frame every atrocity as necessary work. You're not torturing a snitch. You're protecting national security. You're not sabotaging infrastructure. You're preventing communist infiltration. You're not becoming a psychologically programmed weapon. You're serving your country. Easterman reframes everything through this selective populist lens, claiming that what's happening is what reagents wanted all along, what they volunteered for, what they would choose if they understood the bigger picture. The final property references Orwell's 1984, where language itself becomes a tool of control. Newspeak involves creating simplified language that makes complex thought impossible. It involves redefining words so that criticism becomes literally unspeakable. If language doesn't have words for freedom, justice, or autonomy, how can you articulate that these concepts are being violated? Murkoff's Newspeak appears in their institutional language. Kidnapped people are reagents, suggesting they're components in chemistry experiments. Torture facilities are sleep rooms, invoking rest and care. Victims of psychological conditioning are prime assets, suggesting they're valuable resources. Failed subjects whose minds broke under torture are ex-pops, clinical terminology that strips away humanity. Every element of the program gets reframed through language that obscures what's actually happening. The post-trial reports use this newspeak extensively. They reference dissociative sadism like it's a skill to be cultivated rather than a trauma response. They praise groupthink as achievement rather than recognizing it as loss of individual thought. They note insistence on individuation as a problem requiring correction rather than seeing individual identity as fundamental human characteristic. The language makes horror sound reasonable, makes trauma sound like growth, makes psychological destruction sound like development. These 14 properties aren't separate lessons. They're interlocking pieces of a comprehensive system designed to control how people think, feel, and act. Murkoff uses all 14 because they work synergistically. The cult of tradition justifies rejecting modernist values like consent and autonomy. The rejection of modernism makes action without thought seem strong rather than reckless. Action without thought makes disagreement physically dangerous rather than intellectually valid. Fear of disagreement makes differences threatening. Fear of difference directs frustration at vulnerable targets. That frustration feeds obsession with plots. The plots require seeing enemies as both strong and weak. That contradiction justifies total war, where pacifism becomes treason. The war mentality cultivates contempt for weakness. Contempt enables the cult of heroic death. Heroism intertwines with machismo and weaponized masculinity. Masculine aggression reinforces selective populism where only certain voices matter. And all of it gets obscured through newspeak that makes the entire system linguistically unremarkable. This is the framework Murkoff operates within. These are the principles embedded in every trial, every broadcast, every pharmaceutical dose, every architectural detail of Signala facility. Understanding these 14 properties transforms the trials from random horror scenarios into precisely calibrated psychological conditioning. Each trial teaches specific fascist principles through experiential learning that bypasses intellectual resistance and embeds directly into behavioral patterns. The question facing every reagent is whether these principles can be resisted once you understand what's being done to you, whether recognition of the framework provides immunity to its effects, whether knowing you're being programmed gives you power to refuse the programming. The answer is more complicated than you'd hope, because fascist psychology works on levels deeper than conscious awareness. You can know intellectually that you're being manipulated while still feeling the emotional pull of the manipulation. You can recognize propaganda while still experiencing its intended effects. You can understand that Easterman's broadcasts are psychological warfare, while still finding yourself calmed by his voice. This is what makes the Outlast Trials genuinely disturbing. It doesn't just show you fascist conditioning, it implicates you in the process. You play as reagent completing trials, participating in violence, following orders, gradually becoming more efficient at harm. The game forces you into complicity, makes you experience firsthand how difficult it is to resist, even when you know resistance is necessary. And it does all this while being entertaining enough that you keep playing, keep progressing, keep completing objectives, even as you consciously recognize what those objectives represent. That explains why the cult exists. Now we need to understand why people like us are drawn to it. The answer is a lot more uncomfortable. Chapter 3: The Trials as Laboratories of Fascist Transformation. The shuttle doors open onto manufactured reality. You step into a police precinct that feels simultaneously authentic and wrong, like a movie set designed by someone who's never actually been inside a real station. The booking desk sits at the perfect angle. The holding cells line the wall in regulation formation, but the lighting is too dim, the shadows too deep, and the air carries a smell that has nothing to do with municipal buildings and everything to do with fear and blood and electricity. A television screen flickers to life. Easterman's voice fills the space with fatherly warmth. He explains your objective with patient clarity. There's a snitch among the reagents. Someone who can't be trusted, someone whose presence threatens the entire operation. Your team needs to identify this person and deliver them for punishment. He makes it sound reasonable. He makes it sound necessary. He makes it sound like something a good person would want to do. The trial called Kill the Snitch teaches its lessons through environmental storytelling before any violence begins. The police station represents traditional authority, institutional power that's supposed to protect and serve, but this station has been corrupted. Evidence lockers overflow with planted materials. Interrogation rooms contain instruments that have nothing to do with questioning and everything to do with torture. The precinct's design reveals what Murkoff believes about law enforcement, that it's fundamentally about control through violence, that badges grant permission for sadism, that authority exists to break people rather than protect them. Leland Coyle patrols these corridors with proprietorial confidence. He was a police officer before Signala, someone who'd already learned to weaponize his badge, who'd faced complaints about excessive force, but never consequences. Murkoff didn't break Coyle. They gave him an environment where his existing pathology could flourish without constraint. He moves through the station like a predator in his natural habitat. Cattle prod crackling with electrical charge, speaking to reagents with the same contemptuous familiarity he probably used on suspects. When Coyle catches a reagent, he doesn't simply kill them. He performs. The cattle prod delivers shocks, calibrated for maximum pain without immediate death. He drags out the suffering, makes examples, ensures that every other reagent hears the screams and understands what hesitation costs. This is fascism's pedagogy, education through terror, lessons written in pain, knowledge transmitted through watching what happens to those who fail. The designated snitch is randomly selected by the system. They might be the most helpful team member. They might have saved other reagents during previous trials. None of that matters. The accusation itself becomes proof. This teaches a crucial fascist principle. Guilt is assigned by authority. Evidence is irrelevant. Defending yourself confirms suspicion. Reagents learn that innocence provides no protection, that being targeted is the same as being guilty, that the accusation and the verdict are the same moment. Teams that resist, that refuse to participate in identifying and punishing the snitch, discover that the trial doesn't end. Ex-pops flood the area. Coyle intensifies his patrols. The pharmaceutical compounds in the air increase in concentration, creating paranoia and confusion. The environmental pressure builds until cooperation feels like the only path to survival. And cooperation means dragging another reagent to the electrocution cage, strapping them down, activating the switch, watching their body convulse as voltage courses through them. The psychological aftermath of this participation is where the real lesson embeds. Reagents who complete this trial carry knowledge about themselves that's difficult to reconcile with self-image. They killed someone, not in self-defense, not in the heat of combat, but in cold cooperation with institutional demands. The cognitive dissonance creates vulnerability that Easterman's broadcasts exploit immediately. His voice in the sleep room reframes the experience. You didn't murder, you followed necessary protocols. You're not a killer, you're a team player. You didn't betray someone, you protected the collective. This reframing is essential to fascist conditioning. The system makes you complicit in atrocity, then offers psychological relief through justification. If you accept the justification, the cognitive dissonance resolves. If you reject it, you must sit with the unbearable reality of what you've done. Most people choose the relief. They accept Easterman's narrative because the alternative is confronting yourself as someone capable of murder under pressure. The trial doesn't just teach that snitches deserve punishment. It teaches that accepting authority's interpretation of your actions is psychologically necessary for survival. The trial, called Cleanse the Orphans, deploys maternal imagery as weapon. Mother Gooseberry presides over a facility designed to evoke protective instincts, then corrupts those instincts into participation in harm. The orphanage setting is deliberate. Orphanages represent care for society's most vulnerable, institutional responsibility for children who've lost their families. This orphanage has been transformed into something else entirely, a space where childhood innocence is treated as contamination requiring purification. Phyllis Futterman, the woman who became Mother Gooseberry, arrived at Signala with a diagnosis of dissociative identity disorder stemming from severe childhood abuse. Her mind had fragmented into distinct personas as survival mechanism, a maternal persona that expressed love through violence, a childlike persona that treated suffering as play, shadow versions that flickered in and out depending on environmental triggers. Murkoff didn't heal this fragmentation. They weaponized it, gave Gooseberry an environment where her fractured psyche could act out its distorted caregiving fantasies on reagents who couldn't escape. The orphanage is populated with mannequin children, plastic forms positioned in tableaus of innocence. They sit at desks, they lie in beds, they occupy playground equipment. The mannequins serve multiple psychological functions. They create uncanny valley discomfort, looking almost but not quite human. They blur the line between object and person, making reagents question what they're seeing. And they serve as projection screens for whatever Gooseberry needs them to be in any given moment. When Gooseberry speaks to the mannequins, she addresses them as real children. Her tone shifts between personas: maternal comfort, playful excitement, sudden rage at perceived misbehavior. Reagents completing objectives in this environment must navigate around her patrols while hearing her speak to plastic children as though they're living, breathing, capable of disappointing her. The cognitive dissonance is intentional. You know they're mannequins, but Gooseberry's conviction is so absolute that doubt creeps in. What if they're not mannequins? What if they're real children who've been paralyzed by whatever pharmaceutical compounds saturate the orphanage air? The trial's objectives involve cleansing various objects throughout the facility, removing contamination that threatens the children's purity. In practice, this means destroying evidence of previous trials, dismantling recording equipment, incinerating documents that might reveal what's actually happening at Signala. The cleansing language reframes destruction as purification, makes accomplices of reagents by casting them as protectors of innocence, even as they participate in covering up institutional crimes. Gooseberry's punishment for reagents she catches involves forced participation in her maternal fantasies. She'll trap them in scenarios where they must play the role of child or caregiver, must speak lines from her internal script, must validate her delusions, or face escalating violence. This creates psychological damage beyond physical threat. Being forced to participate in someone else's psychotic narrative, to speak words that reinforce their break from reality, creates a kind of contamination. You've entered their world. You've played by their rules. Part of their madness has transferred to you through that participation. The orphanage trial teaches several fascist principles simultaneously. It weaponizes care language to justify control. It creates environments where distinguishing reality from performance becomes difficult. It forces participation in covering up systemic crimes while framing that participation as protection of innocence. And it demonstrates how fractured psyches can be aimed at targets, how people who are themselves victims of horrific abuse can become instruments for inflicting abuse on others. Post-trial reports for the orphanage program track how effectively reagents suppress their protective instincts. High scores go to teams that complete cleansing objectives without attempting to help or understand the mannequin children. Lower scores identify inappropriate emotional attachment or wasted time investigating environmental elements. The message is clear: curiosity is punished, emotional response is weakness. Completing assigned tasks without questioning their purpose is the only acceptable behavior. The courthouse trial, called Vindicate the Guilty, may be the most psychologically insidious. It places reagents on trial for crimes they may or may not have committed, forces them through judicial theater designed to make guilt feel inevitable, then demands confession as the only path to resolution. The trial weaponizes the architecture of justice, takes an institution that's supposed to determine truth and transforms it into a machine for manufacturing false admissions. The courtroom itself is meticulously detailed. Judge's bench elevated above the floor, creating physical hierarchy. Witness stand positioned to maximize exposure and vulnerability. Gallery seating filled with mannequins dressed as observers, their presence creating the feeling of public scrutiny even though their eyes are painted plastic. The environmental design activates deep cultural conditioning about courtrooms as spaces where truth is determined, where innocence can be proven, where justice prevails. But this courtroom operates on fascist principles rather than legal ones. Evidence is presented against reagents, testimony from unreliable witnesses, documentation that may be fabricated, physical proof that seems convincing until you examine it closely. The pharmaceutical compounds administered in the sleep room have disrupted memory formation enough that reagents can't be entirely certain what they've done. Did I commit those acts? The documents say I did. The witnesses claim they saw me. My memory is fragmentary. How can I be sure I'm innocent? This manufactured uncertainty is the trial's core weapon. By disrupting reagents' ability to maintain clear narrative about their own actions, the trial creates space for institutional narrative to fill the gaps. If you can't remember whether you committed the crime, and the court insists you did, and resisting the court's judgment brings pain and danger, then accepting guilt becomes the path of least resistance. This is how false confessions function in real-world interrogations. Exhaust the subject's ability to maintain their version of events, offer relief through confession, make admission of guilt feel like the only psychologically survivable option. The trial doesn't end until reagents confess. Teams can resist for a time, can argue their innocence, can point out inconsistencies in the evidence, but the environmental pressure escalates. Ex-pops appear in increasing numbers. Trial extends beyond reasonable duration, exhaustion becoming a weapon. And eventually, someone on the team decides that confession will end the suffering, and they admit to crimes that never happened or that they didn't commit. The moment of confession is recorded. This creates compromising material that can be used for future control. Reagents who've confessed to serious crimes on tape have given Murkoff leverage. Even if they later claim the confession was coerced, the recording exists. It can be edited, distributed, used to ensure cooperation. The confession becomes a chain that binds reagents to the program. makes escape psychologically and legally complicated, even if physical escape becomes possible. The courtroom trial teaches that truth is whatever authority declares it to be, that maintaining innocence is exhausting while accepting guilt brings relief, that judicial systems are tools of control rather than mechanisms for justice, and that your own memories and perceptions are less reliable than institutional records. These lessons serve fascist psychology perfectly. Populations that don't trust their own memories or judgment are populations that depend on authority to tell them what's real. The factory trial introduces economic dimensions of fascist control. Poison the Medicine takes place in a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility where reagents must sabotage production, contaminate supplies, and destroy machinery while avoiding detection by security and the prime asset called Franco il Bambino Barbie. The trial teaches that workers are disposable, that production is more valuable than safety, that sabotage justifies extreme security measures, and that economic systems function through violence rather than cooperation. Barbie is perhaps the most psychologically disturbing prime asset. He presents as a man-child, someone whose psychological development arrested in early childhood. He carries a truncheon covered in rusty nails and treats violence as play, giggling when he injures reagents, speaking in childish language while committing adult atrocities. His appearance suggests dwarfism, and his behavior indicates profound developmental disability or severe personality disorder. Murkoff found Barbie already violent, already disconnected from empathy, already treating harm as entertainment. They gave him a factory to patrol and reagents to hunt. His childlike presentation makes the violence he commits particularly disturbing because it strips away adult rationalizations. Barbie doesn't torture for ideology or mission objectives. He does it because he finds it fun. This reveals something dark about fascist systems. They don't just use true believers. They use people who enjoy cruelty for its own sake and give them institutional permission to indulge. The factory setting is rich with labor symbolism. Assembly lines produce pharmaceutical compounds, the same drugs that will be used to condition future reagents. Reagents, performing sabotage objectives, are destroying the means of their own oppression, but they're doing so under orders from that same oppressive system. This creates profound irony. You're attacking Murkoff's infrastructure, but Murkoff commanded the attack, making your resistance into compliance. The trial's objectives involve contaminating medicine destined for civilian populations. This teaches several lessons simultaneously. It demonstrates that Murkoff's operations extend beyond Sinhala, that their pharmaceuticals reach ordinary Americans, that the conditioning program has applications in the broader population. It makes reagents complicit in harming innocent people, spreading the guilt beyond the facility's walls. And it normalizes the idea that contaminating supplies, poisoning populations, and causing mass harm can be justified by institutional objectives. Factory workers appear as environmental elements, mannequins frozen in labor positions. This dehumanizes workers, presents them as interchangeable components in production rather than people with rights and dignity. The message is clear: labor has value only as production input. Workers are disposable, and anyone who interferes with economic operations deserves whatever violence maintains efficiency. Post-trial reports for the factory program praise reagents who demonstrate appropriate paranoia about their team members, suggesting that economic competition should override cooperation. They note insufficient ruthlessness in resource prioritization, indicating that reagents should be willing to sacrifice teammates if it improves individual performance metrics. The factory trial teaches capitalist fascism, that economic value supersedes human value, that competition justifies cruelty, that efficiency excuses atrocity. Each trial builds on previous conditioning. The police station teaches that authority legitimizes violence and that accusations equal guilt. The orphanage teaches that care language can disguise control and that participation in covering up institutional crimes can be framed as protection. The courthouse teaches that truth is institutional declaration rather than objective reality and that confession brings relief from unbearable pressure. The factory teaches that economic considerations justify harming workers and that productivity matters more than safety or rights. By the time regents have completed multiple trial rotations, they've been systematically trained in every dimension of fascist psychology. They've learned to obey authority without question, to see violence as necessary tool, to distrust their own memories and perceptions, to sacrifice vulnerable others for group benefit, to accept justifications for atrocity, and to measure their worth through productivity and compliance rather than moral principles or human dignity. This conditioning doesn't feel like brainwashing while it's happening. It feels like adaptation. You're learning to survive in an environment with specific rules. You're developing skills that keep you alive. You're becoming more efficient at completing objectives that the system rewards. The shift from ordinary person to fascist weapon occurs through incremental steps, each one feeling reasonable in context, none of them dramatic enough to trigger conscious resistance. This gradual progression is exactly how fascism operates at the societal level. Populations don't wake up one morning as fascists. They make small compromises, accept small injustices, normalize small cruelties. Each compromise makes the next one easier. Each normalization expands the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Eventually, people who would have been horrified by overt fascism find themselves participating in it willingly because they've traveled to that destination through steps that felt justified at the time. The Outlast Trials makes this progression interactive. You perform the compromises, you complete the objectives, you become more efficient at harm, and the game rewards this with progression systems, upgraded abilities, better equipment, higher scores, access to new content. The mechanical rewards for fascist behavior mirror how real authoritarian systems maintain compliance through benefits for cooperation, through making collaboration feel rewarding, through structuring incentives so that participation is easier and more pleasant than resistance. This creates uncomfortable questions for players. Are you resisting the game's ideology or embodying it? Does recognizing the fascist conditioning make you immune to its effects, or just more aware of your complicity? Can you extract entertainment from fascist simulation without normalizing fascist psychology? The game doesn't answer these questions. It just forces you to ask them every time you complete a trial successfully. The post-trial evaluation reports make the game's critique explicit. These documents, presented as Murkoff's assessment of reagent performance, reveal the grading rubric for fascist transformation. High marks require dissociative sadism, the ability to harm others without emotional connection to their suffering. They praise groupthink and punish individuation, making clear that loss of personal identity is the goal. They recommend increasing bigotry and cowardice in subliminals, openly stating that prejudice and moral cowardice are desirable traits. One report notes, reagents may still be clinging to outer world assumptions, suggest finding methods of introducing additional trauma in the sleep room. This reveals that resistance is met with escalation, that maintaining connection to pre-Signala values triggers more aggressive conditioning, that the system adapts to overcome whatever psychological resilience reagents retain. Another report observes, real effort on display would be easier if there were a clearly disposable weak link among the group. This teaches reagents to identify vulnerable members and treat them as expendable, cultivating the fascist principle of contempt for weakness. and encouraging groups to sacrifice their least capable members. The most chilling report addresses teams that complete trials without casualties. This group seems to still fear death. Good thing? The question mark is crucial. Murkoff isn't certain whether self-preservation instinct is a problem or a useful trait. This ambiguity reveals the system's ultimate goal: reagents who fear death enough to follow orders, but not enough to refuse suicidal missions, who value survival but not above completing objectives, who can be convinced that dying for Murkoff's purposes is meaningful rather than wasteful. These reports aren't just flavor text. They're the game explicitly telling players what's being taught, why it's being taught, and how the conditioning works. The Outlast Trials doesn't hide its critique. It presents fascist conditioning so clearly that players can't miss it unless they're deliberately looking away. This transparency is part of the horror. Recognizing exactly what's happening doesn't give you power to stop it, doesn't extract you from complicity, doesn't make your participation less damaging. The trials continue until reagents are deemed ready for deployment. This readiness is measured through psychological metrics: dissociation from empathy, reflexive obedience to authority, internalized bigotry, willingness to harm others on command, and fear of death calibrated to maximize usefulness. Once reagents meet these metrics, they're released back into civilian life as sleeper agents carrying weapons in their minds that they don't consciously recognize. This release is where the horror metastasizes beyond the facility. Signala isn't an isolated atrocity. It's a production facility for distributing trauma and fascist psychology throughout American society. Every reagent released is a carrier, someone who'll spread the conditioning through their interactions, their behaviors, their normalized cruelty. They'll join police forces, military units, corporate structures, political organizations. They'll occupy positions where their programming serves institutional interests, following orders without question, inflicting harm without remorse, accepting justifications for atrocity without resistance. The game implies that this spread is already happening, that by 1959, earlier iterations of Project Lathe have already seeded American institutions with programmed agents, that the fascist psychology cultivated in Signala has been replicating throughout the culture. This contextualizes the historical moment. The 1950s weren't just about Cold War paranoia and suburban prosperity. They were about systematic psychological conditioning programs producing generations of Americans trained in authoritarian thinking. This is where the Outlast Trials moves from horror game to historical critique. The game isn't just imagining fictional atrocities, it's drawing connections to real programs, real techniques, real systems of control that existed and operated and shaped American culture in ways that persist into the present. MK Ultra was real. Sleep room experiments were real. Psychological conditioning programs designed to break and reprogram human minds were real. The Outlast Trials takes those real elements and extrapolates. What if those programs succeeded? What if the techniques worked? What if the conditioning spread? The answer is disturbing because it suggests we're living in that aftermath. That contemporary American culture carries residue from those conditioning programs, that the fascist psychology cultivated in facilities like Signala has become ambient cultural knowledge transmitted across generations. The game invites players to look at current political rhetoric, current institutional behavior, current normalized cruelties, and ask, is this the result of gradual social evolution? Or is this the flowering of seeds planted by systematic conditioning programs decades ago? That question haunts every moment after you understand what the trials are actually teaching. You can't watch police brutality without thinking about Coyle's Station. You can't see child separation policies without thinking about Gooseberry's orphanage. You can't watch false confessions on true crime documentaries without thinking about the courthouse trial. The game's fictional fascism becomes a lens for recognizing real fascism, for seeing the patterns that operate in the world outside the game. This is why understanding Umberto Eco's 14 properties matters so much. They're not just analysis of historical totalitarianism, they're diagnostic tools for recognizing fascist psychology wherever it appears, in political movements, in corporate structures, in institutional behavior, in cultural norms. The Outlast Trials teaches you to recognize these properties so thoroughly that you can't stop recognizing them. The game infects you with awareness that makes everything else visible, but recognition alone doesn't solve the problem. Knowing you're being conditioned doesn't necessarily give you power to resist the conditioning. Seeing fascist patterns doesn't automatically extract you from fascist systems. The reagents who understand what's happening to them still complete the trials, because the alternative is death or worse fates. Awareness provides clarity, but not immunity. This tension between understanding and helplessness is where the game's horror lives. You know what's being done. You can name the techniques, you can identify the objectives, and you still participate because the game's mechanical structure requires participation for progression, because the systems are designed to make cooperation easier than resistance, because individual refusal doesn't stop the institutional machine. That uncomfortable truth is what we need to examine next. Because the most disturbing aspect of fascist conditioning isn't how it breaks people who fight it, it's how it makes cooperation feel reasonable, makes participation feel necessary, makes complicity feel like survival. The question isn't whether you can resist when you understand what's happening. The question is whether understanding even matters when the system is designed to make resistance psychologically and physically more expensive than compliance. The answer is somewhere between hope and despair, and it depends entirely on whether you believe individual consciousness can maintain integrity under conditions specifically engineered to destroy that integrity. Chapter 4. The Prime Assets as Case Studies in Fascist Psychology. The prime assets aren't monsters, they're case studies. Each one represents a different pathway into fascist psychology, a different demonstration of how human minds break or reveal themselves under pressure. Understanding them requires looking past the horror they create and asking the uncomfortable question, what made them this way? And what does their functionality within Murkoff's system reveal about who fascism recruits and why? Leland Coyle arrived at Signala already broken, or perhaps never whole to begin with. His file indicates military service during World War II, followed by law enforcement career marked by excessive force complaints and suspicious deaths during arrests. Coyle represents the fascist personality that pre-exists authoritarian systems, someone drawn to hierarchy, who experiences sadistic pleasure from exerting power over vulnerable populations, who views badges and uniforms as permission rather than responsibility. His psychology maps onto what Theodore Adorno called the authoritarian personality. Research conducted after World War II identified personality traits that correlated with fascist sympathies: rigid adherence to conventional values, submission to authority figures, aggression toward those deemed inferior or deviant, preoccupation with power and dominance, cynicism about human nature. Coyle exhibits nearly every trait. His police background is crucial. Law enforcement attracts certain personalities, people who value order and hierarchy, who believe in clear distinctions between good and evil, who want authority to enforce their vision of how society should function. Most officers develop these traits in healthy directions, recognizing that authority comes with responsibility and that power requires restraint. But some, like Coyle, experience authority as validation for pre-existing sadism. The badge doesn't create their cruelty. It permits cruelty they were already inclined toward. When Murkoff's recruiters approached Coyle, They didn't threaten or manipulate him. They made an offer that appealed to everything he'd been missing: a facility where he'd have absolute authority, subjects who couldn't complain to oversight boards, the opportunity to use every technique he'd learned in war, and every impulse he'd had to restrain as a cop. They told him he'd be helping America win the Cold War, framing his sadism as patriotic service. Coyle didn't need convincing. He'd been waiting his entire post-war life for someone to give him institutional permission to be exactly who he was. Murkoff understood this. They didn't create Coyle. They identified him, recruited him, and gave him an environment where his pathology could flourish without constraint. This is how fascist systems build their enforcement apparatus, not by turning good people evil, but by finding people who are already violent and giving them badges, uniforms, and institutional legitimacy. In the trials, Coyle functions as mobile punishment. His cattle prod delivers agony without immediate death, extending suffering for maximum psychological impact on both the victim and any reagents who witness the torture. He speaks to reagents with contemptuous familiarity, calling them little piggies and sweethearts, language that infantilizes and dehumanizes simultaneously. His tone carries sexual menace, suggesting that the violence he inflicts carries erotic charge for him. This sexualization of violence is characteristic of sadistic personality structures. The distinction between sexual sadism disorder and sadistic personality disorder matters here. Sexual sadism disorder involves sexual arousal, specifically from others' suffering. Sadistic personality disorder involves deriving pleasure and satisfaction from cruelty more generally, not necessarily sexual, but deeply gratifying. Coyle likely experiences both. The pleasure he takes in shocking reagents, in hearing them scream, in watching them convulse, goes beyond professional execution of duties and enters territory of personal fulfillment. What makes Coyle effective for Murkoff is that he's self-motivating. The system doesn't need to incentivize his violence. He provides it enthusiastically because he enjoys it. This makes him cost-effective. No special conditioning required, no ongoing management needed. Just point him at targets and let his nature do the work. Fascist systems love people like Coyle because they're low-maintenance weapons, eager to inflict harm without requiring elaborate justification or reward structures. But Coyle also represents fascism's limitation. He can terrorize reagents within Signala's walls, but he'd be useless as a deployed agent. His sadism is too obvious, his violence too theatrical. He can't pass as normal. He can't blend into civilian populations. He's a tool for internal control, not external operations. This is why Murkoff keeps him contained, useful for breaking others, but too broken himself for sophisticated deployment. Mother Gooseberry represents something more tragic. Phyllis Futterman arrived at Signala with dissociative identity disorder resulting from horrific childhood abuse. Her mind had fragmented into distinct personas as survival mechanism during trauma so severe that maintaining unified consciousness would have been psychologically fatal. The different personas handled different aspects of existence: a maternal persona, expressing love through violence; a childlike persona, treating everything as play; shadow selves, flickering through when triggered. Dissociative identity disorder remains controversial in psychiatric circles. Some clinicians view it as legitimate response to extreme repeated trauma, especially childhood sexual abuse. Others view it with skepticism, suggesting that many presentations result from iatrogenic influence, therapists inadvertently creating multiplicity through suggestion during treatment. Regardless of causation debates, the phenomenology is real. People who experience themselves as multiple distinct selves, who lose time when other alters are fronting, who genuinely feel they share their body with other consciousnesses. Gooseberry's fragmentation makes her simultaneously victim and perpetrator. The maternal persona believes she's protecting children, caring for them in the orphanage, keeping them safe from contamination. This persona experiences genuine love for the mannequin children, speaks to them with tenderness, becomes enraged when she perceives threats to their safety. The rage isn't cynical or performative. It's authentic, protective anger twisted by psychotic inability to recognize that the children aren't real and that the threats she's protecting them from don't exist. The childlike persona emerges during hunts. This version of Gooseberry treats violence as play, giggles while harming reagents, speaks in childish language about games and fun. This persona isn't trying to be disturbing. It's genuinely experiencing torture as entertainment, the same way a child might enjoy playground activities. The disconnect between tone and content creates horror for observers, but for this persona, there's no disconnect. Playing roughly with regents feels emotionally equivalent to playing with dolls. Murkoff didn't create Gooseberry's dissociation. They weaponized it. They gave her an environment perfectly designed to activate and maintain her psychosis. An orphanage full of child figures that her mind can populate with whatever meaning suits her protective and playful delusions. They ensured she'd never receive treatment that might integrate her personalities or connect her to reality, and they directed her violence toward reagents while keeping her contained within manageable boundaries. This makes Gooseberry a different type of weapon than Coil. He's self-motivating sadist. She's psychotic instrument, genuinely delusional, operating from fractured consciousness that experiences reality differently than neurotypical people. Her violence isn't calculated. It emerges from delusions that Murkoff cultivates rather than corrects. The maternal persona protects children that don't exist from contamination that isn't real through methods that kill actual people. The system exploits her inability to recognize that distinction. What's most disturbing about Gooseberry is her lost potential. With appropriate trauma treatment, personality integration therapy, medication management, and years of careful support, Phyllis Futterman might have healed. Dissociative identity disorder has treatment pathways. Integration is possible for some people. Even without full integration, many people with DID live functional lives, managing their system cooperatively, reducing dissociative barriers. Phyllis never got that chance. Murkoff found her already broken and made sure she stayed broken in ways they could aim at targets. This represents fascism's relationship with mental illness generally. Authoritarian systems don't create mental illness, but they exploit it systematically. They find people whose psychological vulnerabilities make them useful, ensure those vulnerabilities never heal, and aim the resulting dysfunction at enemies or obstacles. The cruelty isn't just that Gooseberry harms others, it's that her harm is preventable, that with appropriate care she might never have become dangerous, that her status as weapon is manufactured through deliberate denial of treatment. Franco Barbie, called Il Bambino, represents the most disturbing prime asset profile. His appearance suggests dwarfism, and his behavior indicates either severe developmental disability or profound personality disorder that arrested his psychological development in early childhood. He treats violence as entertainment, giggles while harming people, speaks in childish language, carries a truncheon wrapped in nails that he's decorated like a toy. Barbie's psychology is difficult to diagnose from external observation. His childlike presentation might indicate actual intellectual disability, meaning he lacks cognitive capacity to understand the moral implications of his violence. Alternatively, it might indicate severe personality disorder, where psychological development froze during trauma, leaving him with adult body and child's emotional cognitive structure. Or it might be performative, a defense mechanism where retreating into childhood persona protects him from confronting what he does. Regardless of underlying explanation, Barbie represents fascism's use of people who harm without comprehension. He doesn't torture for ideology or mission objectives. He does it because he finds it fun, because his moral development never progressed to point where he understood that others' suffering matters, because his emotional landscape is organized around immediate gratification without consideration of consequences. This makes him particularly chilling. Coyle knows he's inflicting harm and derives satisfaction from that knowledge. Gooseberry is psychotic and genuinely believes her violence serves protective purposes. Barbie seems to exist in space where harm doesn't register as meaningful category. He hits people the same way a child might hit insects, not out of malice, but out of underdeveloped capacity for empathy and consequence recognition. Fascist systems use people like Barbie specifically because their lack of comprehension makes them reliable. They won't develop moral qualms about their actions because they lack the psychological infrastructure for moral reasoning at that level. They won't question orders because their cognitive structure doesn't generate that kind of reflection. They'll harm consistently because harming provides them with simple pleasure, unencumbered by guilt or doubt. This utilitarian approach to cognitive disability is among fascism's darkest features. The same systems that genocidally target disabled populations also exploit disability when it serves institutional purposes. Barbie would likely be marked for elimination in many fascist regimes' eugenics programs, viewed as drain on racial purity or genetic strength. But within Signala, his disability makes him useful. So he's preserved and aimed. The hypocrisy is intentional. Fascism has no consistent principles beyond power and expediency. The prime assets collectively demonstrate that fascist systems don't require ideological true believers for enforcement. They require a variety of pathologies, each useful for different purposes. Coyle's sadistic personality provides theatrical terror. Gooseberry's dissociative psychosis provides unpredictable violence softened by maternal aesthetics. Barbie's arrested development provides consistent harm without cognitive resistance. Together they create enforcement apparatus that approaches totality, covering different psychological bases, appealing to and terrorizing different aspects of reagent psychology. This variety also prevents reagents from developing unified resistance strategy. If enforcement came from single source, reagents might learn its patterns and develop countermeasures. But facing Coyle requires different survival tactics than facing Gooseberry, and both differ from surviving Barbie. The psychological whiplash of switching between threat profiles keeps reagents destabilized, prevents them from achieving mastery or confidence, ensures that each trial feels novel and overwhelming rather than manageable through experience. The prime assets also serve as warnings about reagents' potential futures. Coyle demonstrates what happens if you embrace the sadistic impulses the trials cultivate. Gooseberry shows the fate awaiting people whose minds fragment under the conditioning. Barbie represents the infantilization and developmental arrest that can result from sustained trauma. The message to reagents is clear. These are your possible endpoints, different versions of what you might become if you fail or succeed in wrong ways. Yet understanding the prime assets as victims themselves doesn't erase their victimization of others. This is the moral complexity the game refuses to simplify. Coyle was failed by systems that should have screened him out of law enforcement. Gooseberry was failed by everyone who should have protected her during childhood. Barbie was failed by whatever circumstances produced his condition. All three are victims of systemic failures, and all three are perpetrators of horrific violence. Both realities exist simultaneously without one canceling the other. This refusal to simplify is part of what makes the Outlast Trials effective critique. It would be easier to present the prime assets as purely evil, as monsters without backstory or explanation, but that would let the system off the hook. By showing how Murkoff identifies, recruits, cultivates, and deploys damaged people as weapons, the game makes clear that individual pathology is insufficient explanation. The system created conditions where these individuals' pathologies became institutionally useful, gave them environments where their worst traits flourished, ensured they'd never heal or develop in healthier directions. This is fascism's recruitment strategy generally. It doesn't need to create cruelty from scratch. It identifies people who are already cruel, or broken, or vulnerable to particular manipulation, and gives them roles where those traits serve institutional purposes. It finds people like Coyle and gives them badges. It finds people like Gooseberry and aims their delusions. It finds people like Barbie and removes any restraints on their behavior. The individual pathology existed before recruitment. The system's evil is in recognizing that pathology and amplifying it into weapon. For reagents experiencing the trials, the prime assets represent inescapable enforcement. But for players analyzing the game, they represent diagnostic case studies in how fascism builds its apparatus of control. Each one demonstrates different mechanism, different pathway, different way that human psychology can be bent or broken or revealed, and then deployed against others. Understanding them means understanding how authoritarian systems function, not through ideology alone, but through systematic exploitation of human vulnerability, pathology, and damage. And that understanding raises the question we've been circling. If the system is this sophisticated, this comprehensive, this effective at breaking people, and making breaking feel reasonable, is resistance actually possible? Can individual consciousness maintain integrity against institutional structures specifically designed to destroy that integrity? Or is every reagent's resistance ultimately futile? Every attempt at maintaining moral principles ultimately overwhelmed by the trial's accumulating pressure? The answer isn't straightforward, because some reagents do resist. Not all of them break the way Murkoff intends. Some develop strategies for surviving without completely surrendering their sense of self. Some find ways to comply behaviorally while maintaining psychological distance from their actions. Some even begin planning active resistance, looking for ways to undermine the system from within. But those resistors face problems that compliance avoids. They live with constant cognitive dissonance between their actions and their values. They experience ongoing guilt from participation they can't escape. They risk discovery if their resistance becomes visible, and they must navigate impossible questions. Is survival worth the cost of complicity? Does resisting internally matter? If you're still performing the same violent acts externally, can you maintain your humanity while doing inhumane things? Or does participating in atrocity make you complicit regardless of your internal state? These questions don't have comfortable answers. And that discomfort is exactly what the game wants you to sit with. Because these aren't just questions for fictional reagents. They're questions for anyone living within systems that demand complicity. Anyone working within institutions that cause harm. Anyone trying to maintain moral principles while surviving in environments that punish principle and reward expediency. The prime assets stopped asking those questions a long time ago. Whether they made peace with their roles or never experienced conflict about them, whether they embraced their functions or simply stopped resisting them, they've achieved the psychological state where their actions and their sense of self align. They are what they do. They do what the system asks. The cognitive dissonance has resolved through acceptance, but that resolution came at the cost of their humanity. And recognizing that cost, understanding what was lost when they stopped resisting or never resisted in the first place, is essential to understanding why resistance matters even when resistance fails. Because the alternative to resistance isn't peaceful acceptance. It's becoming Coyle, Gooseberry, or Barbie. It's allowing your pathology or your damage or your capacity for cruelty to define you completely. It's losing the uncomfortable tension between who you are and what you're asked to do, not because you've resolved the tension ethically, but because you've surrendered the part of yourself that experienced it as tension. That's the fate Murkoff wants for every reagent, not to make them happy or comfortable or at peace, but to make them functionally aligned with institutional purposes, to erase the distance between self and role, to transform them into instruments that execute commands without internal resistance. Understanding whether that transformation can be prevented, whether consciousness can maintain integrity even while performing complicit actions, whether the core self can survive systematic destruction, is the question we need to examine next. Because the answer determines whether the trials are tragedy or inevitability, whether reagents are victims or collaborators, whether resistance is meaningful or simply delayed surrender. Chapter 5: The Sleep Room and the Reconstruction of Reality. Between trials, reagents return to the sleep room. The space is presented as sanctuary, a place to rest before the next mission. But the sleep room is where the most insidious work happens, where consciousness itself gets rewritten without the distraction of physical danger or immediate survival pressure. This is where Easterman's voice becomes the architecture of your thoughts. The pharmaceutical cocktails administered between trials serve multiple, overlapping functions. The compounds disrupt normal memory consolidation, the neurological process by which short-term experiences transfer into long-term storage. When memory consolidation is impaired, events lose their temporal anchors. You remember that something happened, but not when it happened, or in what sequence or how much time has passed since. This temporal disorientation is intentional. If you can't construct coherent narrative about your time at Signala, you can't analyze patterns, can't recognize escalation, can't track your own transformation. The drugs also enhance what neuroscientists call memory reconsolidation interference. Every time you recall a memory, it becomes temporarily unstable, susceptible to modification before being stored again. The pharmaceutical compounds administered during this vulnerable window can alter how memories are reconsolidated, changing emotional valence, adding or removing details, associating the memory with different meanings. This means that every time you remember completing a trial, the memory of that trial becomes slightly different, slightly more aligned with whatever interpretation Easterman's broadcasts are providing. Over repeated cycles, original memories degrade while reconstructed versions strengthen. You remember electrocuting the designated snitch, but you no longer clearly remember your initial horror at being asked to do so. You remember the orphanage trial, but the memory now carries associations with protecting children rather than participating in institutional cover-up. Your past actions remain accessible, but their emotional and moral context has been chemically rewritten. This is more sophisticated than simple brainwashing. Traditional thought reform techniques rely on isolation, exhaustion, and repetitive messaging to break down subjects' beliefs. Murkoff's approach uses neurochemistry to intervene directly in how memory and belief systems form at the biological level. They're not just changing what you think about your experiences, they're changing how your brain stores and recalls those experiences, making it neurologically difficult to maintain original interpretations, even if you want to. The broadcasts playing in the sleep room exploit these chemically induced vulnerabilities. Easterman's voice provides constant interpretation. You're not suffering. You're growing stronger. You're not being tortured. You're being trained. You're not a victim. You're a volunteer becoming something better. The messages use specific linguistic patterns designed to bypass critical analysis. They employ presuppositions that embed claims within sentence structure, making it difficult to question them. They use truisms that mix obviously true statements with interpretive claims, creating impression that everything being said is equally valid. For example, you've completed another trial, and you should feel proud of your progress. Every challenge you've overcome has prepared you for important work ahead. The discomfort you've experienced is temporary, but the strength you've gained is permanent. The first statement is factually true. You did complete a trial. This truth creates openness to what follows. The second statement contains an embedded presupposition. The trials are challenges you're overcoming rather than atrocities you're being forced into. The third statement reframes suffering as investment with positive return. Each sentence builds on acceptance of previous sentences, creating narrative momentum that's difficult to resist, especially in chemically altered state. The broadcasts also use what psychologists call the foot in the door technique. They establish agreement on small points, then leverage that agreement toward larger claims. You want to be valuable, don't you? Of course you do. Everyone wants to matter, and mattering requires being useful. The most useful people are those who can do what others can't. You're learning to do difficult things. That makes you valuable. The more difficult the things you can do, the more valuable you become. This progression starts with universal human desire for significance and ends at justification for atrocity, with each step feeling like natural continuation of previous agreements. The sleep room's physical environment reinforces this psychological assault. The lighting is calibrated to suppress melatonin production while maintaining appearance of dimness, creating state where you feel like you're resting even though your neurochemistry is being artificially maintained in semi-alert state. This makes you receptive to programming while preventing the deep sleep that would allow genuine psychological recovery. The temperature stays slightly cool, just uncomfortable enough to prevent complete relaxation but not obviously oppressive. This keeps your nervous system in mild activation, making you suggestible without triggering conscious awareness that you're being manipulated. The ambient sound includes frequencies below conscious hearing that create vague unease, making Easterman's voice feel like relief from background discomfort you didn't consciously register. The beds themselves contain biometric monitoring. Murkoff tracks heart rate variability, galvanic skin response, eye movement patterns, breathing rates. This data reveals which broadcasts trigger resistance and which create acceptance. The system adapts in real time, reducing content that activates your stress response and increasing content that you receive calmly. Over time, the broadcasts become increasingly personalized, tailored to your specific psychological profile and resistance patterns. This creates individual conditioning tracks. Two reagents in the same sleep room might receive significantly different messages, each calibrated to address their particular vulnerabilities. Someone with strong family attachments might hear broadcasts emphasizing how their training will enable them to protect their loved ones. Someone with religious background might hear messaging that frames trials as tests of faith or spiritual purification. Someone with history of abuse might hear content that validates their suffering while redirecting anger from Murkoff toward designated enemies. The genius of this approach is that it prevents reagents from comparing notes effectively. If you try to discuss Easterman's broadcasts with another reagent, you discover that their version was different, that they remember different emphases and messages. This creates confusion about what's actually being said, makes it difficult to identify manipulation because you can't establish shared baseline for what the broadcasts contain. The fragmentation isolates each reagent within their own version of the conditioning program. Between pharmaceutical intervention and environmental control and personalized messaging, the sleep room achieves something remarkable and terrifying. It makes you complicit in your own reconditioning. You're not passively receiving programming. You're actively participating in interpreting your experiences through frameworks the system provides. Your brain is doing the work of rewriting your memories, reconstructing your beliefs, reshaping your moral intuitions. Murkoff provides the chemical tools and narrative frameworks, but your neurological systems perform the actual labor of transformation. This distinguishes Signala's approach from cruder forms of conditioning. They're not trying to override your consciousness with external commands. They're trying to modify your consciousness at the neurochemical level so that the thoughts you generate feel authentically yours, even though their content and structure are being shaped by institutional intervention. The goal is for you to genuinely believe that you volunteered, that the trials are necessary training, that your actions serve legitimate purposes, that you're becoming better rather than being systematically destroyed. When this conditioning works, reagents experience their transformation as personal growth. They feel proud of completing difficult trials. They feel capable and competent. They develop sense of identity connected to their role as reagent, taking satisfaction from high-performance ratings and successful trial completions. The suffering they've experienced gets reframed as investment that paid off. The atrocities they've participated in get reconceptualized as necessary actions in service of important goals. Their complicity feels like virtue. This is the most disturbing outcome because it's the most stable. Reagents who are simply broken, who comply out of fear while maintaining internal resistance, remain psychologically unstable. They carry unresolved trauma and moral injury. They're at risk for psychological collapse if conditions change. But reagents who've genuinely internalized the conditioning, who've reconstructed their sense of self around their role in the program, become sustainably functional weapons. They don't require ongoing threats or supervision. They self-regulate according to internalized values that align with institutional objectives. This transformation is what Murkoff measures when they evaluate reagent readiness for deployment. They're not looking for people who are simply obedient. They're looking for people whose obedience has become identity, whose compliance has become conviction, whose participation has become pride. These are reagents who can be released into civilian populations without risk of defection because they don't experience themselves as captive or coerced. They experience themselves as chosen, as trained, as prepared for important work. The psychological term for this transformation is identification with the aggressor. Originally described by Anna Freud, this defense mechanism involves adopting the characteristics, values, and behaviors of someone who has power over you. Children who are abused sometimes identify with their abusers, adopting similar aggressive patterns as way of managing the terror of vulnerability. Hostages sometimes develop positive feelings toward their captors, a phenomenon called Stockholm Syndrome. Prisoners in concentration camps sometimes adopted SS behaviors and attitudes, becoming particularly brutal toward fellow prisoners. Identification with the aggressor serves psychological function. It reduces the unbearable tension of being powerless victim by transforming you into agent allied with power. It resolves cognitive dissonance by aligning your values with the actions you're being forced to perform. It provides sense of control in situations where you have none. And it offers relief from constant fear by making you feel part of the threatening force rather than its target. Murkoff's conditioning deliberately cultivates this identification. The trials force participation in institutional violence, making reagents functionally indistinguishable from the system harming them. The sleep room provides Easterman as father figure to identify with, someone powerful and knowing who can be psychologically aligned with. The pharmaceutical interventions reduce the neurological resistance that would normally prevent this identification, and the entire structure creates conditions where identifying with Murkoff feels like psychological survival strategy rather than capitulation. What makes this particularly insidious is that reagents who've identified with their aggressors often don't recognize it's happened. They don't experience themselves as brainwashed or coerced. They experience themselves as having learned important truths, as having matured beyond naive civilian thinking, as having achieved clarity about how the world really works. The transformation feels like enlightenment rather than destruction. They pity their former selves for being weak, naive, encumbered by moral principles that prevented necessary action. This genuine conviction is what makes deployed reagents effective. They're not reluctant agents performing under threat. They're true believers who've internalized fascist psychology so thoroughly that it's become their authentic worldview. When they're activated by trigger phrases and given missions, they execute with enthusiasm because the missions align with values they genuinely hold. The conditioning hasn't created empty shells following programming. It's created people who want to follow the programming because they believe the programming is right. But here's the question that haunts every analysis of these conditioning techniques. Is reversal possible? If consciousness has been chemically and psychologically reconstructed at this fundamental level, can it be reconstructed again? Can someone who's genuinely internalized fascist psychology through Murkoff's program be deprogrammed? Or is the transformation permanent? The answer is complicated by the fact that we're not just talking about changed beliefs. We're talking about neurochemically altered memory consolidation, chemically induced personality changes, systematic rewiring of how the brain processes moral information. Belief changes can sometimes be addressed through counter-messaging and evidence, but if the neurological infrastructure supporting those beliefs has been modified at the biological level, changing the beliefs might require addressing the underlying neurochemistry. This is where the Outlast Trials connects to real-world concerns about pharmaceutical intervention in consciousness. We're entering an era where neurochemical modification of personality, memory, and belief systems is becoming increasingly possible. The drugs Murkoff uses are fictional, but the principles they're based on are real. We have compounds that affect memory consolidation. We have substances that alter suggestibility. We're developing increasingly sophisticated understanding of how neurochemistry shapes consciousness. The ethical questions this raises are profound. If someone's beliefs and personality have been chemically altered without their informed consent, are they still the same person? Do they have autonomy when their neurochemistry has been modified to make certain thoughts and behaviors feel natural? Is their apparent consent to their situation valid when that consent was cultivated through pharmaceutical intervention? These aren't just questions for Outlast's fiction. They're questions our society will need to address as these technologies become more refined and accessible. The game doesn't provide easy answers. Some reagents seem permanently transformed, genuinely unable to recognize that they've been conditioned because the conditioning has become their entire cognitive framework. Others retain fragments of their original selves, experiencing cognitive dissonance between who they were and who they've become, but lacking tools to resolve that dissonance in ways that would restore their previous identity. A few demonstrate remarkable resistance, somehow maintaining core sense of self, despite everything designed to destroy it. What distinguishes resistors from those who fully transform isn't entirely clear. It's not simple intelligence or education or strength of will. Some highly educated reagents succumb completely. Some who seem initially vulnerable maintain surprising integrity. The variability suggests that psychological resilience under these conditions depends on factors we don't fully understand, possibly including genetic variations in how individuals respond to neurochemical intervention, possibly including early developmental experiences that created particularly robust sense of self, possibly including random variation in how the drugs interact with individual neurochemistry. This unpredictability is why Murkoff runs the program at the scale they do. They're not trying to successfully condition every reagent. They're trying to condition enough reagents that the program remains worthwhile despite failures. The numbers work in their favor. If even 30% of reagents become reliably deployable weapons, that's sufficient return on investment. The other 70% become X-pops. experimental subjects for other projects, or simply casualties. Murkoff's fascism is industrial and actuarial. They're running statistics on human suffering. This industrial approach to psychological destruction is what separates institutional fascism from individual cruelty. A sadist like Coyle inflicts suffering on people he encounters. An institution like Murkoff inflicts suffering on populations systematically, creating infrastructure for processing humans into products. The scale transforms the moral calculus. Individual cruelty is horrifying but containable. Institutional cruelty replicates and spreads, touches thousands or millions, becomes ambient rather than exceptional. Understanding the sleep room's role in this system reveals that the trials themselves are almost secondary. The trials provide raw experiences, emotional intensity, behavioral participation in violence, but the sleep room is where those raw experiences get processed into permanent transformation. It's where the neurochemical and psychological reconstruction happens. The trials break you down. The sleep room rebuilds you according to specifications. Together they form a complete system for manufacturing fascist consciousness at industrial scale, and that system is still operating. The game's setting in 1959 places it firmly in the past, but the implications extend into the present. Project Lathe succeeds in the Outlast timeline. The techniques get refined. The conditioning spreads. By the time of the first Outlast game in 2013, Murkoff has decades of accumulated research on psychological control, research that informs projects like the morphogenic engine and the wall rider. The Signala facility is the beginning, not the end. Its success ensures continuation and expansion. This continuity matters because it transforms the game's horror from contained incident to spreading infection. The reagents who survive Signala carry their conditioning into the world. They join institutions, raise families, influence others through their transformed worldviews. The fascist psychology cultivated in the facility doesn't stay within its walls. It propagates through the carriers, spreading through American culture in ways both obvious and subtle. Some deployed reagents presumably go on to positions of power. Others operate at lower levels, following orders from handlers they don't consciously recognize, performing actions whose purposes they don't fully understand. The trigger phrases embedded during conditioning remain dormant until activated, at which point reagents execute programmed behaviors while experiencing those behaviors as voluntary choices. They're sleeper agents who don't know they're agents, weapons who believe they're acting on their own convictions. This is where the game's critique becomes most pointed, because this spreading network of conditioned agents trained in fascist psychology provides allegory for how authoritarian thinking becomes culturally embedded. The metaphor works on multiple levels. Literally, within the game's fiction, Murkoff has created actual sleeper agents. Figuratively, the game suggests that American culture carries inherited trauma and conditioning from real programs like MK Ultra, passed down through generations, not through direct pharmaceutical intervention, but through cultural transmission of values, behaviors, and psychological patterns. The question of how to interrupt this transmission cycle is the question the game leaves hanging. Individual awareness doesn't seem sufficient. Knowing you've been conditioned doesn't automatically undo the conditioning, especially when the conditioning has altered your neurochemistry. Removing yourself from the system doesn't help others still trapped within it, and attempting to resist the system often just brings you to its attention, making you target for escalated intervention. This pessimistic assessment is where the game's horror achieves its full weight. It's not just showing you terrible things happening, it's suggesting that those terrible things create self-perpetuating systems that are extraordinarily difficult to interrupt or dismantle. That individual resistance might be psychologically meaningful, without being practically effective. That consciousness itself can be colonized and reconstructed in ways that make it nearly impossible to recognize what's been lost. But there's something else happening beneath the pessimism, something the game presents quietly, without fanfare, through elements that are easy to miss if you're focused only on surviving trials. Some reagents do resist, some maintain their sense of self, despite everything designed to destroy it. Some find ways to help each other even when helping creates risk. Some refuse to fully participate in the cruelty even when refusal brings punishment. These resistances are small. They don't stop the system. They don't prevent the trials from continuing or Murkoff from achieving its objectives. But they persist. And their persistence suggests something important about human consciousness, that it's more resilient than systems designed to destroy it give it credit for, that there are aspects of self that survive even sophisticated attempts at reconstruction, that the capacity for resistance might be as fundamental to human psychology as the capacity for conditioning. This brings us to the final question. What does resistance look like when complete escape is impossible? When you're trapped within a system designed to transform you? When every aspect of your environment is calibrated for conditioning? When even your own neurochemistry has been weaponized against your autonomy? What options remain? Chapter 6: Resistance, Complicity, and the Question of Survival. The problem with resistance inside Signala is that every form of resistance creates its own complicity. You can refuse to complete trial objectives, but refusal results in your death or transformation into X-Pop, removing you from the reagent population and eliminating any potential for future resistance. You can complete objectives with minimal violence, but completion still means participating in institutional goals, still means becoming more skilled at the behaviors Murkoff wants to cultivate. You can maintain internal psychological distance from your actions, but internal distance doesn't prevent external harm, doesn't make the snitch you electrocuted any less dead. This impossible situation is the game's most sophisticated critique. It's not presenting clear moral choices between good and evil actions. It's presenting situations where every available action involves some degree of moral compromise, where survival requires complicity, where the cleanest hands belong to corpses. This reflects uncomfortable truths about living within unjust systems generally. Pure resistance often isn't survivable. Survival often requires accommodation, and accommodation inevitably involves becoming complicit in the system you're accommodating. The reagents who demonstrate the most successful resistance are those who find ways to minimize harm while maintaining survival. They complete trial objectives but do so in ways that reduce casualties. They help other reagents when possible, sharing resources and information. They maintain small acts of human connection that the system discourages, learning each other's names, showing empathy for each other's suffering, refusing to treat teammates as disposable, even when Murkoff's grading system rewards that treatment. These small resistances don't stop the trials. They don't prevent Murkoff from achieving its conditioning objectives, but they maintain something essential: social bonds that the system is trying to destroy, human recognition that the conditioning is trying to erase, moral awareness that the pharmaceutical intervention is trying to suppress. The resistors are playing long game. They're not trying to defeat the system through direct confrontation. They're trying to maintain enough of themselves that if opportunity for escape ever appears, there'll still be people capable of taking it. This strategy has historical precedent. Prisoners in concentration camps who maintained small acts of resistance, sharing food or refusing to brutalize fellow prisoners even when doing so brought punishment, often described those acts as essential to psychological survival. The acts didn't liberate the camps, but they maintained sense of self and humanity that might otherwise have been completely destroyed by the camp's systematic degradation. The resistance was meaningful to the resistors even when it wasn't strategically effective. against the system. The game presents this through subtle details. Reagents who've completed multiple trials together sometimes develop nonverbal communication, coordinating without speaking in ways that suggest relationship beyond what Murkoff's team-building exercises would produce. Some reagents deliberately draw prime asset attention to give teammates time to complete objectives or reach safety. Others share supplies even though hoarding would improve individual survival odds. These behaviors don't align with the selfish individualism and contempt for weakness that the trials are designed to cultivate. Post-trial reports sometimes note this cooperation with confusion or concern. Reagents displaying inappropriate solidarity or excessive concern for team welfare appear as criticisms rather than praise. This reveals that Murkoff recognizes cooperative behavior as threat to their conditioning objectives. They want reagents who function as team tactically but remain isolated psychologically. Genuine human connection between reagents creates resistance network, creates possibility for collective action, creates foundation for maintaining values the system is trying to erase. The pharmaceutical conditioning makes this cooperation neurochemically difficult. The drugs promote paranoia and reduce empathy. They make it harder to maintain positive feelings toward others. They suppress the neurological processes that normally create social bonding. Reagents who manage to cooperate meaningfully despite this intervention are fighting their own modified neurochemistry, using conscious intention to override chemically influenced impulses toward isolation and suspicion. This neurochemical resistance is exhausting. It requires constant monitoring of your own thoughts and impulses, constant questioning of whether what you're feeling is authentic response or chemical influence. It means recognizing that your paranoia about other reagents might be pharmaceutical effect rather than accurate threat assessment. It means forcing yourself to maintain trust and cooperation even when your altered neurochemistry makes trust feel dangerous and cooperation feel foolish. Not everyone succeeds at this. Many reagents succumb to the isolation the drugs promote, becoming suspicious and self-protective, treating teammates as competitors or threats. This makes them easier to condition because their isolation prevents formation of support networks that might provide alternative interpretations of their experiences. Isolated reagents have only Easterman's broadcasts as source of meaning and explanation. Reagents who maintain connections to others have alternative voices, other perspectives, social bonds that create obligation beyond institutional demands. Murkoff understands this dynamic. They deliberately cultivate isolation through multiple mechanisms. The team compositions change between trials, preventing stable groups from forming. The grading system creates competition between reagents, even though they're ostensibly cooperating. The trials include objectives that require identifying weak links or designated enemies within the team, and the pharmaceutical compounds promote the neurochemical states associated with isolation rather than bonding. Despite these obstacles, resistance networks form. They're fragile and limited, but they exist. Reagents find ways to communicate that avoid surveillance. They develop codes or signals. They share information about prime asset behavior, patterns, or trial objectives. They warn each other about which reagents seem to have fully adopted Murkoff's conditioning and might report others who show resistance. These networks operate beneath the official program structure, creating parallel social world that Murkoff doesn't fully control. The existence of these networks matters beyond their immediate practical benefits. They prove that institutional control is never total, that human social bonding is resilient enough to persist even under conditions designed to prevent it, that consciousness can recognize and resist conditioning even when that conditioning operates at neurochemical level. The networks are evidence that the sleep room's reconstruction of reality isn't completely successful, that fragments of authentic self and genuine human connection survive the systematic attempts at destruction. But these networks also face impossible dilemmas. The more successful they become at providing support and maintaining resistance, the more visible they become to Murkoff's surveillance systems. The more visible they become, the more they attract institutional intervention designed to break them apart. Reagents who are identified as network organizers face escalated conditioning, increased pharmaceutical doses, more frequent trial rotations, isolation from their cooperators, or assignment to particularly brutal trial scenarios designed to break their resistance. This creates tragic calculation. Is it worth organizing resistance if doing so brings escalated suffering? Is it better to maintain small, invisible acts of resistance or risk larger organized opposition? Is the potential for collective action worth the certain individual punishment that follows identification as organizer? Different reagents answer these questions differently based on their psychology, their level of conditioning, their assessment of odds. Some conclude that survival requires appearing to fully adopt Murkoff's programming while maintaining internal resistance. They perform enthusiasm for trials, demonstrate the dissociative sadism that earns high grades, participate fully in violence and cruelty, while internally maintaining awareness that they're performing rather than genuinely embracing. This strategy is psychologically costly. Performing cruelty, even as conscious performance, still means committing cruel acts. The performance doesn't protect victims from harm, and maintaining psychological distance between performed self and authentic self requires constant cognitive effort that can break down over time. There's also risk that performance becomes reality. If you consistently act cruel, if you practice behaviors associated with dissociative sadism, if you train yourself to harm without hesitation, those practiced behaviors can become habitual. Neuroscience shows that repeated behaviors create and strengthen neural pathways. Performing cruelty trains your brain in cruelty. Eventually, the gap between performance and reality closes. You become the thing you were pretending to be. This is one of the game's darkest implications, that conscious resistance through performance might be self-defeating, that attempting to game the system by appearing compliant while maintaining internal distance might simply result in gradually becoming genuinely compliant. The psychological distance you're trying to maintain erodes through repeated performance until you can't distinguish authentic self from performed role. You've saved your life through strategic performance but lost yourself in the process. Other reagents conclude that visible resistance is worth the cost even when it brings punishment. They refuse to participate fully in violence. They speak openly about their awareness that they're being conditioned. They attempt to help others recognize the manipulation even when doing so identifies them as problems requiring elimination. These reagents generally don't survive long, but their resistance matters to others who witness it. Seeing someone refuse to comply, even when refusal brings terrible consequences, proves that refusal remains possible, that the system hasn't achieved total control, that human dignity can be maintained even at extreme cost. These visible resistors often become martyrs in informal reagent mythology. Stories circulate about reagents who refused to identify the snitch and were torn apart by ex-pops, about reagents who tried to help prime asset victims and were caught and tortured, about reagents who spoke the truth about Murkoff's program and were removed to unknown fates. These stories function as inspiration and warning simultaneously. Inspiration because they prove resistance is possible. Warning because they demonstrate its cost. The game never clarifies which strategy is correct. It presents multiple forms of resistance without endorsing any as superior to others. The reagent who performs compliance while maintaining internal distance survives longer but risks losing authenticity. The reagent who resists visibly maintains integrity but sacrifices survival. The reagent who builds resistance networks helps others but brings danger to those they help. There's no clean moral victory available, no strategy that achieves resistance without compromise or cost. This moral ambiguity reflects the game's refusal to simplify. Real resistance within totalitarian systems looks like this: messy, compromised, inadequate, often unsuccessful, occasionally tragic. The game doesn't offer fantasy of heroic resistance that defeats fascism through individual courage. It presents resistance as difficult, costly, frequently futile, and still necessary because the alternative is complete surrender to systems designed to destroy human dignity. The question isn't whether resistance succeeds at stopping the system. The question is whether resistance succeeds at maintaining something human within the system, whether consciousness can preserve fragments of dignity and autonomy and moral awareness even when those fragments don't translate into liberation. The answer seems to be yes, barely, with enormous effort at significant cost. The resistance that's possible is small and insufficient and vastly outmatched by institutional power, but it persists. This persistence matters because it reveals something essential about human psychology that fascist systems consistently underestimate. They assume that sufficient pressure will break everyone, that consciousness can be completely reconstructed according to institutional specifications, that systematic conditioning will eventually produce uniform compliance. But human consciousness is more variable and resilient than these assumptions allow. Some people break completely, others break partially, some refuse to break at all, and the systems can't always predict which category any individual will fall into. This unpredictability is why Murkoff runs the program at scale and accepts high failure rates. They know they can't condition everyone successfully. They compensate through volume. But the unpredictability also means that even reagents who appear fully conditioned might be performing, that even agents who seem reliably deployable might retain fragments of resistance, that the system's products are never as standardized and controllable as the system wants them to be. This gives resistance a shadow existence within fascist systems. It's always there, not always visible, not always organized, not always effective, but persistent. The systems can suppress it, but never completely eliminate it. And that persistence means that totalitarian control is always incomplete, always requiring ongoing maintenance, always vulnerable to collapse if conditions shift enough to make resistance less costly or more coordinated. The Outlast Trials doesn't show that collapse happening. It shows the system functioning, processing reagents, producing weapons, achieving its objectives. But it also shows the hairline cracks, the small resistances, the fragments that don't fit the institutional model. And those cracks matter because they're where light gets in, where change becomes possible, where the seeds of systemic failure take root, even while the system continues operating successfully at surface level. Chapter 7: The Legacy and the Warning. By 1959, Project Lathe has been running for 3 years. Hundreds of reagents have been processed through Signala. Many have broken and become ex-pops. Many have been conditioned successfully and deployed into civilian populations. Some have died during trials. A few have escaped, though whether they truly escaped or were released as test cases remains ambiguous. The program is functioning exactly as Murkoff intended. The deployed reagents carry their conditioning into American society. They join police forces, bringing with them the lessons learned in Coyle Station. That authority justifies violence, that accusations equal guilt, that brutality is appropriate response to perceived threats. They join military units, carrying Easterman's teachings about obedience, mission focus, contempt for weakness. They join corporate structures, spreading the factory trials lessons about disposability of workers and primacy of production over human welfare. They join government agencies, carrying courthouse lessons about truth, as institutional declaration rather than objective reality. These individuals don't identify as programmed weapons. They experience themselves as competent professionals, as people who understand how the world really works, as realists who've moved beyond naive civilian assumptions. Their conditioning feels like wisdom rather than indoctrination. They believe they're acting on their own convictions, unaware that those convictions were systematically cultivated through pharmaceutical intervention and psychological manipulation. They're sleeper agents who don't know they're sleeping. The trigger phrases embedded during their conditioning remain dormant until activated. When activated, reagents execute programmed behaviors while experiencing those behaviors as autonomous choices. The activation doesn't feel like external control. It feels like sudden clarity, like recognizing what needs to be done, like conviction that drives action. The programmed behavior and the sense of autonomous decision-making are neurologically intertwined, making it nearly impossible for activated reagents to recognize that they're following programming rather than exercising free will. This creates a distributed network of controllable agents throughout American institutions. Murkoff doesn't need to maintain direct command and control. They just need to deploy activation triggers when they want specific actions taken. The reagents do the rest, executing programmed objectives while believing they're acting on their own judgment. This makes the system remarkably efficient and difficult to detect. There's no obvious conspiracy, no visible central coordination, just individuals making decisions that happen to align with Murkoff's interests. The game connects this 1959 reality to its contemporary present. By 2013, when the first Outlast takes place, Murkoff has had 54 years to refine these techniques. The morphogenic engine at Mount Massive Asylum represents evolution of the sleep room's conditioning methods. The Walrider Project represents weaponization of consciousness at new scale. The experimental programs continue, spread, evolve. The techniques pioneered at Signala have metastasized throughout Murkoff's operations and presumably beyond. This continuity transforms the games from horror entertainment into speculative history. What if the MK Ultra programs succeeded? What if the techniques worked and spread? What if the conditioning became institutional rather than experimental? What would American society look like after generations of systematic psychological manipulation? The Outlast series suggests an answer exactly like it looks, because the conditioning already happened, because we're living in its aftermath, because the fascist psychology cultivated in facilities like Signala has become culturally ambient. This reading might seem paranoid, but the game builds its case carefully. Real programs like MK Ultra existed. Real experiments like the sleep room happened. Real conditioning techniques were developed and deployed. The game's fiction extrapolates from these facts. What if those programs were more successful than publicly acknowledged? What if they continued after officially ending? What if private corporations took over where government programs left off? Each step feels plausible enough that the accumulated speculation achieves disturbing credibility. The game's Cold War setting creates additional resonance. The 1950s are remembered as a period of prosperity and normalcy, suburban expansion, and economic growth. But beneath that manufactured normalcy, as the game reminds us, extraordinary things were happening. Psychological experimentation, development of conditioning techniques, systematic attempts to reprogram human consciousness. The pleasant surface masked darker operations. This historical pattern repeats. Systems of control function most effectively when they're invisible, when populations don't recognize they're being manipulated, when totalitarian structures disguise themselves in democratic or therapeutic language. The Outlast Trials makes these invisible structures visible. It shows the machinery of fascist conditioning in explicit detail. The architectural design, the pharmaceutical interventions, the behavioral trials, the psychological manipulation. The institutional frameworks. By making the machinery visible, the game provides diagnostic tools for recognizing similar structures elsewhere. Once you understand how Murkoff operates, you start noticing operational patterns in real institutions, the careful targeting of vulnerable populations, the use of care language to disguise control, the systematic destruction of social bonds, the cultivation of contempt for weakness, the deployment of authority as justification for violence. This pattern recognition is what makes the game educational despite being fiction. It's teaching you to see fascist psychology and institutional control mechanisms that operate in the real world. The teaching happens through experience rather than lecture. You play as someone being conditioned. You experience how the conditioning feels. You understand why it's effective. This experiential education is more powerful than abstract analysis because it's emotionally resonant. You don't just intellectually understand that conditioning works. You feel why it works, why resistance is difficult, why people succumb even when they recognize what's happening. But the game's educational project includes a warning. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't grant immunity to them. Knowledge helps, but it's not sufficient protection against sophisticated conditioning, especially when that conditioning includes pharmaceutical intervention in neurochemistry. This warning applies to the game's fiction and to real life. Knowing propaganda techniques doesn't make you completely immune to propaganda. Understanding manipulation doesn't prevent all manipulation. Recognizing conditioning doesn't automatically undo conditioning you've already internalized. This is uncomfortable truth because it suggests that individual awareness, while valuable, isn't sufficient response to institutional control. You can be aware that you're being manipulated and still be successfully manipulated. You can recognize conditioning and still follow conditioned patterns. You can understand the machinery and still get caught in it. This isn't because awareness is useless. It's because the systems are sophisticated enough to operate on levels that awareness alone can't fully address. What does provide more robust resistance is collective action. Individual reagents in Signala struggle to resist successfully, but reagents who form networks, who maintain social bonds, who cooperate and support each other, demonstrate more resilience. They're still trapped in the system, still conditioned by its operations, still compromised by their participation, but they maintain fragments of autonomy that isolated individuals lose. They provide each other with alternative interpretations of their experiences, social support that buffers institutional pressure, reminder that their authentic selves exist beyond their roles as reagents. This suggests that resistance to fascist conditioning requires social infrastructure. Isolated individuals are vulnerable. Connected communities are more resilient. Systems that destroy social bonds make populations easier to control. Systems that maintain or create bonds make populations harder to manipulate comprehensively. This is why authoritarian regimes consistently attack social institutions that aren't under state control. Religious communities, labor unions, cultural organizations, family structures. These institutions provide alternative sources of meaning and identity that compete with state propaganda. The Outlast Trials demonstrates this by showing what happens when those protective social structures are systematically dismantled. Reagents arrive having already fallen through social safety nets. They're recruited specifically because they lack strong community ties. The facility then prevents new bonds from forming through pharmaceutical intervention, frequent team rotation, competitive grading structures, and cultivation of paranoia. The resulting isolation makes conditioning far more effective than it would be if reagents maintained robust social connections. This isolation is both historical reality and contemporary warning. This historical reality is that programs like MK Ultra specifically targeted isolated individuals, prisoners, mental patients, people without families or resources. populations whose isolation made them vulnerable and whose complaints could be dismissed. The contemporary warning is that increasing social isolation in modern society creates similar vulnerabilities. When people lack robust community connections, when social bonds are mediated primarily through digital platforms designed to optimize engagement rather than authentic relationship, when atomization becomes default state, populations become more susceptible to conditioning and manipulation. The game doesn't offer simple solutions. It presents problems without clear resolutions. Fascist conditioning that works, resistance that's costly and often ineffective, systems designed to destroy human dignity, operating successfully. This refusal to provide comforting answers is part of its strength. The game doesn't pretend that recognizing fascism defeats fascism. It doesn't suggest that individual heroism overcomes institutional power. It doesn't offer fantasy where the good people triumph through moral clarity and determination. Instead, it shows fascism as persistent, adaptive, effective, institutional system that processes humans into products and spreads through society like infection. It shows resistance as difficult, compromised, frequently unsuccessful, and still necessary because surrender means accepting the complete destruction of human dignity. It shows that systems of control can be resisted but not easily defeated, can be survived but not without cost, can be recognized but not simply because recognition alone provides insufficient protection. This realistic assessment is both the game's horror and its value. The horror is in confronting how effective fascist conditioning actually is, how vulnerable human consciousness is to systematic manipulation, how difficult meaningful resistance becomes under conditions engineered to prevent it. The value is in gaining clear-eyed understanding of how these systems operate, what makes them effective, where their vulnerabilities lie, and what genuine resistance requires. The ultimate lesson isn't that fascism is unbeatable. It's that defeating fascism requires more than individual awareness or moral principles. It requires collective action, maintained social bonds, institutional structures that protect human dignity, and systematic opposition to systems of control. It requires recognizing that consciousness itself is battleground, that the fight happens at neurochemical and psychological levels, as well as political ones, that protecting human autonomy means protecting the neurological and social infrastructures that support autonomy. The Outlast Trials teaches these lessons through horror because horror is effective pedagogy. The emotional impact makes the lessons memorable. The interactive participation makes them experiential. The disturbing content ensures you can't easily dismiss or forget them. You don't just learn about fascist conditioning abstractly. You experience simulated version of it. You feel what it's like to be systematically broken down and rebuilt. You understand why people succumb, and that understanding stays with you long after the game ends. This staying power is the game's greatest achievement. It creates awareness that persists, that makes you recognize patterns in the world outside the game, that provides vocabulary and frameworks for understanding institutional control. It infects you with consciousness that can't be easily suppressed. And that conscious infection is the game's gift. Not comfortable entertainment, but uncomfortable education disguised as horror, teaching you to see what systems of control would prefer remain invisible. The question now is what you do with that education. The game can't answer that question for you. It can show you the machinery, it can teach you the patterns, it can demonstrate why resistance matters even when it fails. But whether you use that knowledge, how you respond to recognizing these patterns in the world around you, what you do with awareness of how fascist conditioning operates at individual and institutional levels, those choices belong to you. The Outlast Trials ends not with resolution but with continuation. The trials keep running, more reagents are processed. The conditioning spreads. Murkoff achieves its objectives. The system functions. This isn't satisfying narrative conclusion. It's realistic assessment of how institutional evil operates. Persistently, efficiently, successfully, without dramatic defeats or final endings. The evil continues because it's built into structures that survive individual opposition, that adapt to resistance, that reproduce themselves across generations. But within that continuing system, small resistances persist. Fragments of human dignity survive. Consciousness maintains capacity for recognizing and refusing programming, even when that refusal comes at tremendous cost. These small resistances don't defeat the system, but they prove it hasn't achieved total victory. They demonstrate that human consciousness is resilient enough to maintain fragments of autonomy, even under conditions designed to destroy all autonomy. They show that fascism's promise of complete control is never fully realized because consciousness itself resists standardization and total reconstruction. That's not a triumphant ending, it's a realistic one. And in its realism, it contains both warning and hope. The warning is that fascist conditioning works, that institutional control is sophisticated and effective, that resistance is difficult and often unsuccessful. The hope is that resistance remains possible, that consciousness persists, that human dignity proves resilient enough to survive even systematic attempts at its destruction. The choice between accepting the warning and acting on the hope is yours. The game has shown you how the machinery works, what you do with that knowledge, how you respond to recognizing these patterns operating in the world around you, whether you choose comfort of ignorance or difficulty of resistance. Those decisions shape not just your individual life, but the kind of society we collectively create or allow to continue existing. The trials are waiting. They're always waiting. The question is whether you walk into them willingly, whether you resist when walking in is inevitable, or whether you work to dismantle the systems that create trials in the first place. The Outlast Trials can't make that choice for you. It can only show you clearly enough that the choice exists, that stakes matter, and that pretending you're not making a choice is itself a choice with consequences.